welcome to NowCouch. We're sitting here with a couple of friends. I've got Randy, Haas, Alex, and Heather. And I'm Jason, so welcome to the NowCouch. What we're talking about today is I've just got ServiceNow. I'm talking about the implementation. I need to know what I need to do first, and I don't really know what to do. So let's get started. I would say the first thing that I do, guys, is I will implement CMDB. And the reason I do that is because that's I think it's the hardest, but also it's one of the core tables of the platform. They started with two, task and CMDB, right? What do you guys think?
Go ahead.
No, I agree with you. The challenge with that is it's also probably the most non-sexiest part when you're initiating a rollout or initiating and introducing an instance of ServiceNow. So how do you make, I think for me is, a challenge for me is how do you make CMDB as attractive to talk about and as attractive to showcase as part of other aspects of ServiceNow and IT.
How do we wow them with CMDB? Wow, you get to track your stuff, right? Data is tough, right? But on the business side, I think the best way I would sell it to leadership would be it's the core foundational data that you need to move forward with any instance, right? You're gonna need it for business purposes. Well, what do you do with the CMDB? As an executive, how would you approach that?
Well, to make it even less attractive, to go back before implementing CMDB, go back to like paper and say, like, what are we trying to get out of this? And a lot of places don't necessarily do that. They don't start with, what are we trying to get out? They kind of have a vague idea of the problem they want to solve, but not a very clear idea of the problem they want to solve. And so if you get that on paper, like, this is a very clear idea of the problem I want to solve. These are the graphs I want to see. This is a dashboard I want to have. This is the metrics I want to know about. This is how I know that our company is doing well. I know that this implementation is giving us money back. And you get all that out, then that tells you what you need to track in the CMDB. But a lot of times you just kind of start with a vague problem and you just randomly throw things together, and then you try to figure that out afterwards. Like, what kind of reports can we get instead of what reports do we need and building toward that?
Right. And things like, how many times have you turned on the CMDB and they said, we just want to hit the URL, just point it and push go, and then it discovers everything. Yeah, and it discovers like 15 million CIs, and you're like, well, what are you going to do with that data? I have no idea, right? So but that's what the executives are looking for, right, is how do I turn this into money? Well, they've got problems, and I've got to get my IT staff doing this. I got to get this doing this. And they never really understand the importance, I don't think, of the CMDB and of establishing that core set of data and getting it not just halfway there. So that haven't done like halfway there. Well, what do you think your completeness is? Well, about 60%. You need your completeness to be like 80%, right? You need to know what you have. And I think the way to sell it to leadership is you have infrastructure that you don't even know about. You have infrastructure that may be failing. How are you going to deal with any of that infrastructure if you don't know about it? If you haven't identified it, right?
Well, unfortunately, I think one of the biggest reasons how executives come to know about the importance of CMDB is when they have to go through a refresh project.
Right.
Because come to find out the initial rollout was done in a certain way a year, 2 or 3 years into the ServiceNow experience, come to find out they're not getting the benefits that they were advertised at the beginning. And come to find out it's because the CMDB is not as mature as it should be, or at least they would like it to be. Now there's gaps and spots where there's holes where there needs to be connectivity, but there isn't because it's not mature enough.
On that kind of, in my, the initial question that you asked, I differ from you guys in the fact that I don't think CMDB should be first, and that's why. It's because I don't think that you've learned ServiceNow and mature start with something else, you learn a little bit about it, then whenever you go implement CMDB, you're gonna know a little bit more and be able to establish more of what you need.
So what do you like to start with? Pretty much anything to get you going to start with, or?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there is, it depends on the organization and what
It
they
does.
use, but you can start with incident. Everybody uses that, and it gives everybody a place to start. Then you realize, well, if I had this information for the incident from the CMDB, then it would be more helpful.
Right. You know, it's interesting that you say that, because a lot of people, and this is a lot of projects that I've been on have started in other places, and even in one of my most recent projects, I actually recommended not starting at the CMDB. But it was because they were in such disarray. They didn't have any policies for their organizational structure as far as what they owned, right? Their tool set, you know. How many computers do you have? I don't know. What do you have in your server room? I don't know. How many Azure, right? How many Azure servers you have? I don't know, right? They were at a position to where if we would have started there, it would have been a failure.
From your experience, what are the top 3 places customers usually start out with?
So for me, it's going to be ITSM, CSM, and HR. Those are the 3 big ones that I've seen. Now, FSM's an interesting one because FSM has taken off quite a bit with ServiceNow and has gone a long way, but I've seen a lot of these implementations fail very quickly with FSM if they don't implement CMDB first. Because FSM is so heavily dependent on it that it becomes problematic if you're just okay, I'm just going to go forward, because there's so many things that are tied to it. Inventory, for example, you've got your field service guys got to go out with equipment and stuff, and they go out there, and you're not tracking any of that. Well, you have a problem there, and that's just not going to solve the inherent problem you have. Yes, is it going to manage sending people out? Yes, but that's not your biggest problem. Half dozen tools do that. Their biggest problem is sending them out with what equipment, what parts, what stuff, so they have the stuff that they need to fix it, and you keep track of all those things so they don't end up off the truck somewhere, right?
You know, with FSM, it introduces another layer of complexity as opposed to ITSM, where you're talking about service desk agents that are sitting in a room on a floor. They're not deployed out to the field where GPS is necessary, where you don't have to worry about vehicles and such when you are sitting in a service desk type of a room. And so FSM, that
It gets crazy.
it highlights another need for why having a more mature CMDB pays off in the long run as opposed to the short run.
Absolutely.
I was additive, the CMDB is the core, basically, of everything else that happens in ServiceNow. And it ties all the different modules together. And so the stronger it is, the stronger everything else is after that. And that goes back to that idea of, like, you mentioned it, like, that's not the big problem that you're trying to solve. And a lot of companies don't take that effort to go back. What is the irreducible problem that we're trying to solve? And we're solving symptoms rather than actually solving, like, the actual problem. And when you get real clarity on the actual problem that you're trying to solve, then that really helps you to decide, should we start with ITSM or should we start with CMDB? Or, because maybe you're at a stage in your company where the biggest problem you're trying to solve is you've got too much volume of calls and you've got to take care of that. So start with
ITSM.
that. But you know that you're going to come back and do a re-implementation later, like you want. ServiceNow is sold, and a lot of times, like Microsoft Word. Like, this is what you need to do X, Y, Z, right? This is, if you've got buying a project, this is what you need to do project.
Right.
If you're doing onboarding, this is what you need to do onboarding or whatever. And it's sold like it's this off the shelf, ready to go thing. In reality, it's like a big grab bag on eBay of Legos.
Yeah.
Right? And if you don't get a picture of what you want to build with those
Right.
areas, and you're never going to be able to sort the parts and figure out the steps that you're going to need to take to build what you're wanting to build.
Right.
So you really have to look at it that way. Like, what is the picture that I'm going to,
Right.
that I'm building toward when I put this together? And I mean, you said a couple of times selling to leadership.
Right.
And I think the biggest part of that is you got to listen to leadership, find out what keeps you up at night, and then because it's going to be different for every leader. What keeps you up at night, and then you put that in the terms of, okay, well then you need to have this visibility, this through line from top to bottom, and that's what CMDB gives you, and that helps you avoid that nightmare that you're
Right.
right, and that's how you get
Yeah.
on board.
You both mentioned ITSM. Yeah, I think the sexiest part, one of the sexiest parts of ITSM is incident management, because that's how you log tickets. That's how you log problems. And until you move into problem management, change management, and even knowledge, that's when you get to realize having a mature CMDB really highlights the key features of all those, kind of ties that together.
Well, and it's things like, well, what are you logging that incident against? So what's the problem why does that incident exist? Well, it may be because some piece of your equipment, something in what should have been in your CMDB is broken, right? And how do you track that? And and you're right, it's an evolution. And what they don't understand, what most people don't understand is, you're right, it's a Lego pack. It's a bag of Legos, right? But it's that way almost intentionally.
Absolutely.
But it's a maturity thing. So you can say you started ITSM but don't build yourself in a corner to where I've seen them so many times take out the CMDB piece of it, right? And replace it with additional categories and subcategories and things like that about what they're doing. And that's okay temporarily, but I would encourage you not to do that. Because I would encourage you, once you get that implemented, you need your CMDB to support that. Then you need your CMDB then to support problem management. Then you need your CMDB to support the next piece and the next piece and the next piece. But the reality is, every piece of ServiceNow fits together. And if you heavily customize it, that's where you're going to end up with a lot of problems. Now, configure, yes.
Yeah.
But don't break the system to fix it.
Right.
And CMDB is a good example. If you break it, you're going to have problems, and you're always going to have them.
I think the hard thing with CMDB is, more than any of the other areas, it really requires the two components, the tool and the people, to be in sync. And so it's not just a matter of designing the CMDB well, it's a matter of, I need governance, I need to make sure my people understand the governance, I need people who own the data, and I need to make sure that they understand, what does that mean to own the data, right? Because you can have a great design CMDB, but if you have 100 change tickets and 99 of them reference the same CI, you're not getting any data out. You're getting data, you're not getting any information.
Right, Well, and I love that, because one of the things that we talk about quite often is governance, right? CMDB is nothing without governance. CMDB is nothing without data integrity. So what do? ServiceNow is typically the system of record, not the source of truth. So what do? We need integrations. We need real-time integrations. We need integrations that update on a regular basis. Things like LDAP, right? We need to bring that people data in. We need to bring in discovery. We need to, these are pieces that we need to bring in, that we're not the source of truth. But the data has to be kept really, really clean. And in order to do that, you've got to have governance.
I think you're highlighting that to have a mature CMDB, it requires more than one or two people spending 2-3 hours of the week trying to maintain and fix the data when needed. You really truly need a group of dedicated people to monitor and maintain the CMDB, and having integrations even complicates it even more.
It does.
And it's something that I don't feel like is highlighted enough out there, that I hope people do come to realize. It may hurt in the short term, but it's going to pay off in the long term.
And they're so focused on getting to that next level they're so focused on going from crawl to walk to run that they never truly get the crawl right? I mean, they're crawling a few steps and falling on their face. So that's where we need to make sure that we get the crawl right first. We get the data right first. We get the right people to support it. I mean, we have the IRE engine and deduplication and all that stuff, right? But how many times have you seen them just never even put those things in place?
Right. Yeah.
We're just
not
even, nothing. And that's a shame, because if you do that right, that stuff runs somewhat on its own. You still have to work on it and continue to build more, right? I mean, that's the whole deal, right? You need people to be able to do that, and people don't put enough emphasis on it.
And I know we're probably going to get into this later on, but the crawl is something that is not paid enough attention, because how, with all the focus on AI nowadays, how are you going to get there without having a good solid foundation of data?
Yeah.
Because if you have not so good data, then you're not going to have you're also going to have not so good outcomes as a result of it.
Garbage in, garbage out, right? I mean, we've been saying that for 20 years, but do people really listen? Because I'm still seeing the same things these days that I saw 10 years ago, and they're just like, well, we don't know what to do about it, and I don't know.
Depends on how close to running out of money. Listen,
True, Listen, I have no more money, what can we do?
I think brought up a great point earlier about one of the hard things with CMDB is the skills. It's not necessarily the intuitive skills.
That's true. And it's heavy into integration, right? It's heavy into a skill set that not a lot of people have. I actually have a really good friend that is like, that's his thing. Like, he loves the CMDB. And I'm like, that's never been my favorite tool, right? But he is just obsessed with it. And so I'm always going to him for questions because he loves it and he's always in it, right? It takes somebody like that. Find somebody, if you're in a big organization, you need to find somebody like that. Find somebody that likes it, and that loves it, and wants to do it.
That's a valuable person to not only have in your organization, but also to have as a colleague. Who's somebody to reach out to you do have questions.
Absolutely, yeah. So
if you're a small organization, that's definitely one of the areas where you should probably reach out and use an implementer or a partner.
Oh, for sure. And I will say that lots of partners have specialties now. But a lot of partners are still doing I can do everything. You need to find a partner that has the right resource and the right resources to be able to handle the CMDB. It's quite a different tool.
So, since we're on the topic of implementations and what to do, how do you pick a partner?
Hat and sort of guy. Yeah. You are anyway. But yeah, it's hard. I interview a lot of different partners, and I will tell you that it's hard because you have to make sure and see through what they're not telling you, and you can't look at just their ratings with ServiceNow. You do need to look at that. You need to look at their previous responses from their surveys. You need to look at what projects they've done. But don't look for the cheapest. Don't look for the biggest. Look for the person who kind of builds your trust. And there are a lot of those partners. And I would say I've been let down by some of the big ones. And I've been with some of the big ones that have been great.
I've made some good money cleaning up after
Oh yeah. And I think that's why ServiceNow has done a cleanup operation at the end of last year. And there were a significant number of partners that were downgraded. And like a lot of partners were downgraded. And that comes down to, I think, that exact thing. People like me and you, all of us, we're seeing the results of bad implementations. And lack of listening to people. But part of that is not their fault. Part of that's the company's fault that hires them.
Yeah.
Because not to completely throw a wrench in this, but they don't have roadmaps. When you start a new instance, when you say, I'm going to jump in the bandwagon of ServiceNow, what do? They go, I want to implement something, let's call somebody.
Yeah.
Not, let's get anybody to tell us what's the right way to implement, what should we implement first, second, third, and last. They don't have anybody to come in and look at their business. What are your business problems? Like, if you don't do that, how do you know?
That's the way ServiceNow sells too. Is you have a conversation with them, you give kind of an inkling of what you're trying to solve, and then let them introduce you to this partner.
Yeah.
And you talk with them. I would say harshly throw out anybody that comes in and says we have a playbook. Because 9 times out of 10, in my experience, that's code for we're not planning to listen to a word you say. We have a method that we do. We're going to charge you X amount of money for this method, and we're going to run through it. And whether you get what you want out of it or not doesn't matter. We're running through this.
Well, if I could go back to a point that you made before, I think it's important to not only know how these external companies spin up an instance, but how much experience do they have with maintenance and upgrading, patching. Because if you're only dealing with organizations that only have experience with spinning up an instance or spinning up a project, but they don't have experience with maintenance, support, what happens after you reach that climax? How do you continue on with this relationship?
Right.
If they don't have that experience, to me that's a warning flag, because I would want to work with someone not only being part of the onboarding process, but also with the implementation, the support and maintenance in the long term, because then it gives me an idea that they're not in for the quick win of just setting something up there
and it's a relationship at that point, right?
Yeah.
You build a business relationship and they help you and you help them, and that is a good relationship. That's a good partner. A good partner is going to stick with you over the thick and thin. They're going to be with you in the long run. They're going to come check on you. I mean, it's like a friend. If one of you guys ended up in the hospital, I'd go check on you. Well, you could have your instance flatlining, and all of a sudden, that implementer nowhere to be found. Okay, and you're done, right?
I would also add that the implementers that have experience with maintenance and support after the fact, they're going to be more cautious with the initial implementation of them too, because
they're not going to have to deal with the consequences.
Yeah, right, yeah.
And, for myself, I learned the most from the mistakes that I made.
Oh, yeah.
And I try my best to not to make those mistakes again. And so if you bring on implementers that really they either aren't involved with the support and maintenance side, they're just in the setup and look for the next customers to help out. Well, that gives you a little bit of unease, because how do I know the advice you're giving me is for the long term as opposed to the short term?
It's short-sighted.
Well, and I also think that they need to be knowledgeable specifically in the apps that you're going to implement.
Yeah.
Somebody can know a lot about ServiceNow and have no idea on the specific.
Especially the one you've been working with lately. But it's true. ServiceNow, when it started, when we were, for all of us, we were started, right? It's like 10 years we've all been doing this, and we were looking at it and going, oh, well, this is you've got ITSM, that's about it. You got 10 things you can do with it, and now it's so huge and so massive, and then they've grown so much that there's a reason that people need to specialize. I personally love some applications, and I'm not a fan of some applications. But it's not because it's not well built. I'm not a fan because I just don't know enough. It's like I went through all the SecOps training. I managed as a SecOps instance. Actually, where we met, I was working with the SecOps team. And to this day, I would turn down a SecOps job because it's not my forte. Listen, I love the ServiceNow part of it, but there is so much more that you bring from people that are outside of ServiceNow that you have to get that. And there are people that I've found inside ServiceNow that know all those other pieces as well as the ServiceNow piece. That's the guy you need. You don't need the guy that only knows ServiceNow. You need the guy that knows SecOps and ServiceNow.
Sure.
And that's especially on the development side, right? Leaders need to understand it, and that's another thing I find interesting. Leaders not doing training. Like one of my first month that I met you, you went to Texas with me to go to training for ServiceNow, right? And you were my manager at the time because you wanted to know more about it. There isn't very many people that have that kind of dedication.
Well, it's survival.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, I think you don't have to know everything about a solution in order to manage a team that runs it or to make strategic decisions around it. But you do have to develop a lot of trust. So if you're going to undercut your people and not listen to them, then you need to learn and understand it. But if you're going to treat everybody with trust and you're going to listen to the decisions and the recommendations that they make, then you don't need to know it. So it kind of depends on that trust-knowledge dynamic.
Right.
The more trust you have within your team, the less direct knowledge you have to have. The less trust you have, the more direct knowledge you have to do it. And you can't scale if you're trying to do all the knowledge.
Right.
So you do need to learn it. You do
Basic understanding, overview.
Put the time and effort into it, but you really need to invest in your people
Yeah.
and invest in the relationship with the people. And I think you talking about implementers from a business leadership perspective, you need to look at that as an investment. It's a long-term thing, and not look at it as I need them to come in and do X and then leave. Because, like we talked about earlier, with it being like a box of Legos, even if you're not doing any customization, no code, your instance is going to look different than anybody else's instance. That is a lot of knowledge.
Right.
Right, and that takes time and energy and effort and money to train that knowledge up. And your implementers getting that knowledge as they're working with you. Your team is getting that knowledge as they work with you. And anytime you switch implementers, anytime you turn over your team, you're losing that time and effort over and over again to get there. So when you're building that relationship, I think it is very important to look at it as a long-term relationship, not just a come in, do this, turn this on, and walk away kind of thing.
Right.
Because it is difficult because you get 5 years down the road and you're like, I don't know why we made this decision to do this. And so then you've got two choices: rip it out and find out what breaks as you ripped it out, or reverse engineer it, and neither one of them are cheap.
No, they're not.
Something that you all brought up before was the topic of customizations. And not only do customizations add on to the complexity and the challenges of turnover and trying to remember why did we do this 4, 5, 6 months ago, and there's a turnover in resources. It's just a challenge that you didn't expect that you would have at the time. And not only that, but going back to the CMDB, when you introduce customizations early on, that's just going to make it more challenging to when you come to realize why aren't things working the way they are.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, not only did you not pay enough attention to the CMDB,
Right.
but then not paying enough attention to out-of-box features,
Right.
allowing them to work together with the CMDB. But when you introduce customizations on top of that, you're just moving yourself away more so from the center than what I would hope it to be.
Right, yeah. I learned that the hard way. And I think we all
I
did,
think
right?
we all did.
So,
That's how we learned, though.
Oh, absolutely. And I learned partly from somebody else's mistakes. About the time I met you, actually, I ran. It was the third ServiceNow customer, and everything was custom. everything was custom. Every time you did an upgrade, everything broke. So my recommendation when I started, I'm like, oh, you just need to reboot, right? Go back to out of the box, trash what you got. And given that it was a school, they couldn't get they weren't brave enough to go that route. And so they wanted to do it incrementally. And so we did it every upgrade. We would take 3 months to upgrade. And we would start with rolling back. We rolled back 1,000 customizations every time we did an upgrade. And when you do that, you have this visceral reaction to customization.
It's a hard truth that I don't believe new ServiceNow customers come to realize. It's when you're looking at a new tool as a replacement to an existing tool that you're trying to work off of, you have to try not to mold this new tool to what you've been using. And I know it's a hard thing to grasp, and it's a hard thing to actually think about and go through. But if you're not able to rethink your own existing processes and patterns to try to fit with what this new tool offers, I truly think you're digging yourself into a bigger hole than what you already are. And I truly believe you're going to pay for it with time, money,
1,000%.
resources.
How many times have you seen an implementation where people have like 8 different tools? ServiceNow is one of 8 tools to solve the same problem, and it's because one department has a preference, a strong preference for the way this report looks, or a strong preference for the way this workflow works. And instead of coming together and saying, what is the happy medium that we can all live with? We're spending all this extra money on all these other things, or that customize it to your point to make this one little niche, thing, instead of saying, hey, maybe we should break the process and figure out a way to be more efficient in our process with the tool that we're selecting.
And how many times have you gone into a project and said, lift and shift? And then all of a sudden you're like, this is not going to work. This is bad, right? We don't want to do that. And they're like, well, no, we have remedy. We just want to lift and shift it.
Yeah.
So it is one of the most difficult things to have those conversations. They have to be made.
Yeah.
Well, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I think going back to the conversation of what is a good implementer,
Right.
Good implementers have these difficult discussions, these challenging discussions of their customers. Sorry to be interrupted.
You're right.
Making sure the right people are in the room when you're having those conversations.
Absolutely.
That
is a great point. You've got to have, and you have to have leadership sponsor. I mean, if your leaders aren't behind you, if they're not in the room, and you're not solving their problems with everybody else's, then that's a problem.
But they do need to be in the room, but they need to not be the only ones in the room.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
No leaders?
Yes.
Well, again, harshly, if you're a leader and you're only in the room for the sales calls, you don't need to be in the room. Either hand that off to your people and let them make the decisions and give you recommendations, and stay out of the sales call, or get your hands dirty, understand what's going on, know what your team's facing and working with, and then sit in the room from that perspective. But don't just show up for the flashy meetings.
Well, guys, on that note, I really appreciate you being here. This was a lot of fun, and we're going to have lots more conversations, both about this stuff and others. So, but yes, look for our podcast. This is a lot of fun. I think you'll have a lot of fun with us. I appreciate it.